introduce yourself, Professor Ssali, and then introduce your guest?
I am Professor Ssali, Charles, Ugandan doctor, trained in medicine and specializing in surgery. I'm here to introduce to you a guest, Mr. Beilik, a scientist from the United States, a scientist with a very respectable background in education. He's a survivor of the Philadelphia experiment, which some of you may have read about as a very, very history-making science venture by the United States Navy. And here is the man who survived the disaster that struck during that experiment and is here to tell us his story as it happened. And we will be going into some of the complexities that led to what happened, and we'll ask him to give us a layman's approach to the understanding of the science of the Philadelphia experiment. This is Mr. Beilik. Could you please introduce yourself?
Yes. My name is Beilik, Alfred Beilik in full, and that has been my legal name for now some 75, well today is 76 years. And prior to that I had a different family name as Edward Cameron. I was born as Edward Cameron, in fact, and family was well positioned, had money. They went through education at Princeton University, a bachelor's degree and then a master's degree in physics, and then I went to Harvard to complete my education. It was a doctorate in physics. My brother, Duncan, was truly a half-brother, legally speaking, went over to the University of Edinburgh in Edinburgh, Scotland, to get his full education there. I was in fact born in 1916, 4th of August 1916, not what the birth certificate for Beilik says. And I went through all the schooling. It was finished by the summer of 1939. My father took me over to Europe, pick up Duncan from Scotland, and then go see my real mother, my natural mother, who was then living in a castle on the town of Königsberg, Germany, and was obviously quite well off. Of course, she had servants, and there was a big brown sandstone castle right on the river. And that was the last time I saw it. It was just before World War II. Because on September 1st, 1939, we got on a plane to come back to the U.S. And then, at Father's insistence, having been a Navy man himself, we joined the Navy and became part of what was eventually known as the Philadelphia experiment. It was not called that in the earliest days. It was called Project Invisibility. It had been started in 1931 with some theoretical work by Nikola Tesla. In 1933, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who became the 32nd President of the United States, invited Tesla to Washington, and after an exchange of information and amenities, Tesla was made the director of the project. And he remained in that position until March of 1942, when he bowed out. But it has a long and interesting history. But my part in that, as well as my brother's part, was that we joined the Navy, enlisted in 1939. We were given officer's status because of our education, and probably because Father may have twisted somebody's arm. He had strange connections in those days, which we didn't know much about or understand. But it was set up that we would, after finishing our basic, which was a 90-day orientation school, we were assigned to the Institute of Advanced Study to work with Dr. John von Neumann and Nikola Tesla and so forth on the Project Invisibility. And of course, at that time, we found that there was a huge gap in what they teach in terms of science in the schools and universities and what they were doing in private in the Institute of Advanced Study. But we became part of the project, and from that time on, Our lives were quite literally centered around that project and Navy life and so forth, because we both enlisted, until such time as the thing became a disaster. But it was interesting. There's a long history, both of theory, practice, practical applications of the science, and of course, eventually the disaster, which got everyone.
That's a very, very important step in the records of science. And I think it is a great honor for you to have taken part in such an experiment, although it may have caused you problems. But I think for posterity, you stand out as the survivor that we've been able to trace, that can tell us about the inside story of this experiment. I know that there's been a lot of cover-up on this experiment, and for a long time the United States did not want anything to be known about this project. But could you please tell our viewers the science that was used in producing invisibility, if that's not still a state secret?
Well, that is not a problem to tell you about it, but it might be a problem for some people to understand it. The first thing we found out when we went to the Institute of Advanced Study was that the normal understanding of physics and the universe is rather far behind some of the newer discoveries and work that was done by a number of people, mathematical contributions by a number of people, John von Neumann, Einstein, a mathematician from Germany who was in the background because John von Neumann understudied him before he came to the U.S., and that was in 1930, I think it was, that John von Neumann came to the U.S. Einstein came to the U.S. also in 1930, and he, for 3 years, taught, believe it or not, at Caltech. And I have friends who knew him there. And the stories are not all consistent, but basically he was there at from 1930 to 33 at Caltech Institute of Advanced Studies, which he did in 1933. There were 4 original members of that staff: John von Neumann, Albert Einstein, a Dr. Oswald Veblen, and a 4th man, whose name at the moment I forget, but who, those 4 founded the, shall we say, the background staff of the Institute of Advanced Study. Now they had access to, let's say, the private research of a number of people and the private thoughts and some rather advanced physics. And with that, they put together of how, because it started with a basic idea of Einstein, not Einstein's, of Tesla's. Can you make a physical object such as a table here or a chair invisible to sight? And that was a long theoretical discourse which went on through the years up until 1940, when they finally first made it work. And the physics is rather unique. It's rather strange. I'll give a very brief description of it. I'll not go into the math. Basically, it was revolved around the idea that we have 4 basic energies in the universe. The first 3, I think everybody's heard of: the electric field, the magnetic field, and the gravity field. It is a field. From that, you can access the time field if you know how to manipulate the first 3 correctly. And if you manipulate the time and access the time field, you can then do a number of things. One, time travel. That was not the goal of this project, but it became involved. The goal was invisibility, and by the means they sought to do it by, or thought to do it by, was creating a phase shift in the time field, sufficient that an object would drop out of visibility, and what would happen was light waves, or energy from, let's say, radar, which didn't exist in 33, would literally go around.
Excuse me, can we just stop for a little moment? Short moment. Stephen, you need this? Is everything okay with the sound? Yeah? Good? Ja, dus dat is het. Heb je goed geluid? Ja?
I don't have the moment.
The theory was that you could manipulate the time field, or actually you manipulate the object you wanted to make invisible, whether it's a small object, table, chair, or, in the case of the Navy's interest, a warship. You manipulate its position or relationship with the time field. If you go about 60 degrees, you have not slipped out of this physical reality, but you have created a situation where electromagnetic waves will travel around that object. And if they travel around it and it show visibly what is in back of that object, you will not see the object, because light or the electromagnetic energy, if it's radar or whatever, has to be reflected, or some part of it has to be reflected. If there's no reflection, you don't see it. That was the very basic theory in the simplest form. It sounds simple from that sort of a description, but it took 12 years of work to get any kind of a system to work at all. And it did work very successfully in 1940, in September, at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, with a very small ship they chose. It was Tesla's equipment, his choice of equipments and approach. And it worked. The ship became completely invisible to sight. They weren't concerned then about radar, because actually, if you can make it invisible to light, you also make it invisible to radar, because they're both electromagnetic radiations, different frequencies. So they had the first successful test in 1940. The Navy classified the project. It became called, from that point on, Project Rainbow. And then, of course, they had to dig in for some harder work. What do you do to make a larger ship invisible? How big does equipment have to get? Is this approach going to work? And so forth. Well, it's a long story involved, but I'll try to make it short, just for the sake of your listeners and viewers. After the 1940 test in September, of course, the project was classified. In January 1941, Duncan and I were sent by the Navy out to sea, as the Navy put it, to learn what being an officer in the Navy is all about. So, it was orders. We went to sea on the USS Pennsylvania, long since defunct. But that was the flagship of the Navy at that time. So it was a rather nice billet. It was comfortable. We went all over the Pacific. Ship came into Pearl Harbor October 1941 for overhaul. It was an older ship. It was commissioned in 1916. So we went on leave and eventually went to San Francisco. And we were there a certain period of time, and our orders were cut to return to Pearl Harbor on the 5th of December 1941. We're about to board a plane. We were intercepted by a Navy captain who said, "Your orders are canceled, come with me." So Duncan and I followed him up to an upstairs room of the Alameda Naval Air Station, where we were about to depart on a plane, and we met then the then head of the Office of Naval Engineering. It's now called the Office of Naval Research, but in those days it was Office of Naval Engineering. So we talked with him, and he says, "Your orders are canceled. We have reason to believe that the Japanese are going to attack Pearl Harbor within 48 to 72 hours, and we don't want you there. So stay here," and we were in San Francisco at that point, and finish out the essential, what would be called the tour time, for the Pennsylvania. And in January, they'll go back to the Institute. So this was December 5th. Of course, 2 days later, everybody knows what happened. Pennsylvania was not even hit in the dry dock, because they knew it was in dry dock, and there was not a target. It did get hit by some flying shrapnel of other ships. So they put it back in the water, as it were, out of the dry dock, and took the ship up to San Francisco and finished the repair work there. But we stayed in the San Francisco area until January, returned to the Institute. At that point, because Tesla had been given, who was still director of the project, had been given a very large ship, battleship, to make invisible, the preparations were all underway, but he was very concerned that with the amount of power to make a ship that size invisible, using the approach that they were then using, they were going to have some sick or dead sailors. So we went ahead with the project up until March of '42, when he decided he wasn't going to complete it. He sabotaged the project. Nobody was hurt, of course, and he bowed out and says the test and the project is a failure. Well, it was only a failure because he chose for it to be so. So he was replaced by Dr. John von Neumann, decided he wanted a whole new approach and wanted to change a number of things. And he did. From that point on, we went on, we were there, of course, so he went on with a somewhat new approach, or digital or pulsed engineering approach, pulsed power, instead of continuous analog, which is the system which Tesla had used. And basically, after many months of research, the Navy and von Neumann both decided they wanted a volunteer crew for the tests when it came time. And they wanted a ship that was selected for the project. And that's where it gets into a bit of confusion, because the ship we used was the Eldridge, and there were two Eldridges. The one that we used, which was launched in July of 42, went into dry dock in September of 42, and they finished the outfitting by December of 42, and then, of course, the long preparations in early 43. The Navy officially says the project never took place, and they still say that to this day. But along about June or July of 43, they laid the keel for another ship, a sister ship, if you will, which became known officially as the Eldridge DE-173. And it was launched in July of 43, commissioned in about August 27th or 28th, 43, but it never was part of the project. It took a lot of time to learn this, to put all the pieces together. It went straight to sea in the war. But the 173, which was the official designation for the ship which was to be used, it did, of course, stick around. They had a very similar appearance, but they were not identical ships, as the archive photos show. So when the equipment was all on board and they had everything ready, they had the first test. The first test was in July 22nd of 43, preceded by a sea trial, and that was very successful. The ship became completely invisible. It was radar invisible, because in the meantime radar came into being and became a major concern. It was radar invisible and optically invisible. And after about 20 minutes of the test, which was not in the yard, but about 6 miles downriver of the Delaware River, and was in an area called Tinicum Island. Tests were fully successful, except when they were over and they shut the equipment off, they found out that the sailors who were stationed on deck most deliberately to be observers of what they could see while the ship was invisible. Basically what they saw was the ship was there. They could see the ship at about, let's say, 3 to 6 feet from beyond the railing. There's nothing but a fog. They couldn't see anything else but the fog. Unfortunately, the exposure for those who were out on the decks was sufficient that they were quite ill. They were sick, they were nauseous, and so forth. The rest of the volunteer crew, which was below decks, were unharmed, undamaged, not affected, because they were shielded by the steel. Today, most of the hulls of the ships are not steel or aluminum, or the smaller ships. But the steel shielded them. They were not affected, but those who were on deck were severely affected. So the Navy says not to worry, we'll have another crew for you. They had actually selected one large group of volunteers, divided into 2 test groups. So they said, go ahead and get it ready for the next test, and they also told von Neumann, we don't want full invisibility. We want radar invisibility, but not optical. Those who were historically aware, of course, there was no lower-end, no shore-end, no long-range navigation in those days, no satellites, no GPS systems. You only had your radio, the standard radio systems to communicate with, and if the ships were optically invisible, at night in a storm they might ram each other if you couldn't see where that ship was, because there was no electronics at that time which would tell you where the other ships were. If you're radar invisible, you can't even tell where your ship in your own convoy is. So that was a concern of the Navy. They said, we don't want full optical invisibility, only radar invisibility. So it was modified. Not a problem. Then the second test was on 12 August 1943. The Navy finally laid it down to von Neumann, then director, that you have until the 12th of August to finish these tests, or forget it. Well, that was a very strange statement and request, because since when does the hierarchy in the Navy, and we finally did run down who it was Admiral King, who was CNO of the Navy, who laid that down, that it would be by the 12th of August. We couldn't understand it. Why should a man who is concerned with the operation of the Navy as a whole throughout all the theaters of the war, be concerned about an engineering test. Well, we never did figure that out until in the 90s, many, many years later. But he was not the originator of that order. He gave the order, but it came from elsewhere. So we had until the 12th of August to have the ship repaired. So came that fateful morning. By the 9th of August, everybody had that queasy feeling in the pit of their stomach that something was very wrong. But nobody knew what, and nobody had any idea. So we started the tests. And let's say the first 60 to 70 seconds to those observers on the 3 ships observing, which was a carrier, it was a Coast Guard cutter, and it was the SS Furiaset, a commercial merchant marine ship. Everything seemed to be going right. The ship was still visible through a greenish fog, but radar-wise was completely invisible. And there was a blinding flash. The ship disappeared. It did come back 4 hours later. But in the meantime, nobody knew what was going to happen. And when it did come back, there was some very serious problems. They couldn't raise anyone on the radio, was number one. Well, I was still there. Duncan was not. The captain couldn't be located. The radio communication just didn't get through. So they sent a boarding party. Board the ship, find out what's going on. Of course, you could easily see it through the binoculars. You could also see that there were some sailors milling around the deck in a very strange manner of being totally disoriented and didn't act like anything normal. So the boarding party got on the ship and they radioed out, well, we got 2 sailors buried in the steel deck. They seems that their bodies are intermingled with the steel. They said they're obviously dying. There's 2 more they found in a bulkhead, standing upright, but in the same condition, dying. 5th man had a hand buried in his in the bulkhead up to here, roughly. He lived. They cut his hand off and gave him an artificial hand later. But then when they went around there, they found me, and I gave my reports. Duncan was not there. So the Navy decides, let's have a board of inquiry for about 4 days. I gave my testimony. They didn't believe it. Others gave various testimonies, and they quite literally did not understand at all what had happened. But they decided to have another series of tests because the equipment was smashed and wrecked, which Duncan and I had done deliberately. Now, to fill in the other side of this story, that is the side from what the observers saw there in the harbor. The ship disappeared, then it came back to the same point. They did, of course, with a second boarding party, take the ship back into the yard, into the back section, and refurbish it for another test. But what happened on board the ship, though, as far as Duncan and I was concerned, we were in the control room. Of course, the doors were closed. We had no windows. And when we say the door was closed, everything was shut down in the sense that we had no outside visibility. We turned equipment on as per radio instructions in the normal manner, and everything seemed to be functioning normally. And after about 30 seconds or so of operation, things started to go awry. We had large numbers of electron vacuum tubes to drive literally the coils for the 2 large generators which are used to generate the primary power for the coils. We had a set of coils on deck to create a magnetic field. We had, of course, RF equipment, very high powered, to generate a rotating magnetic field, which was from 4 booster transmitters, 2 megawatt RF boosters after the final stage, with a lot of preceding equipment. And they had a special antenna, what they called a quadrophase antenna, 4 lobes, which generated 4 lobes of RF energy, and due to the system being designed as it was, the RF field rotated counterclockwise. The magnetic field also rotated counterclockwise due to the way the phasing was set up with the generators. But all of that still seemed to be functioning normally, but what was happening is with the large coils on deck, they were driven, of course, by the 2 generators, but the generators in turn had their field coils driven by 3,000 6L6 tubes. I don't know if you've ever seen a vacuum tube of the 6L6 type. Whereas today everything is solid state practically, except for very large transmitter tubes, and they're even going solid state now. But these tubes were glowing with a particular brightness. But then they started to change that light level. They got brighter, they got dimmer, increased the level of illumination, which we were not concerned with how much light they're putting out, but that was indicating something was going on that wasn't appropriate. They got dimmer and so forth. And then we started to get high voltage arc over in the control room. A little strange. There was no high voltage equipment in the control room, but it sure appeared like high voltage equipment arcing over. We tried to get somebody on the radio. All we had was static. And at that point, we decided what they had told us was in effect. That is, we are on our own. If something goes wrong, you may well be on your own in there, and you have to do what you feel is appropriate. Instructions to Duncan and myself. So we tried to shut the equipment off. Couldn't shut it off. Every knob, every control handle was frozen. Not possible to move it. Well, this strange phenomena continued to get worse in the control room. We couldn't shut anything off. We could not raise anyone on the radio. So we decided it was time to vacate the premises, if you will. In other words, get out of there. When we did, we went through the bulkhead door and went out on deck, saw sailors milling around, but nothing unusual at that point. And we said, well, to ourselves, what do we do? We decided to jump overboard and leave the ship. In a certain sense, you could call that dereliction of duty, but it was not, because we have been told you do what you feel is appropriate, whatever you think is proper. We abandoned the equipment because we couldn't do anything with it. We decided to jump overboard, saying we'd swim ashore, because we were both good swimmers, and it was only a half mile from that point to shore. So we jumped overboard. We never hit the water.
I understand from your story that you jumped overboard and ended elsewhere.
That is
but before you tell us that part of the story, which I know must be very interesting, could you tell us, were you continuing to see, while you're on board, were you continuing to see the ship as you have always seen it before, apart from the glow that you saw? But was everything else remaining in your mind and in your environment as it was before? Although to the people on the shore, it probably had become invisible, but you continued seeing the normal thing.
Yes, to us on board the ship, everything seemed normal. We could not see beyond the railing more than, let's say, 3 feet. It was a very heavy fog, 3 to 6 feet. It was very foggy. Couldn't see anything on the surrounding countryside. We couldn't see the shore. No one there could. But we did not have any feeling that there was anything really seriously wrong. We just decided to jump overboard, expecting to hit the water in a normal manner and go on back to shore and report to whoever was over there. It didn't work out that way. We jumped overboard all right, but we never hit the water. We just kept falling. We felt like we were falling and falling and falling. And eventually, we landed on dry land at night, and we didn't know where we were at that point, but we did find out later. Basically, it was Montauk Point, an operating military base in the extreme tip of Long Island. Now, this is from Philadelphia, the extreme tip of Long Island. And we landed there inside a chain link fence, which was part of the base, and suddenly there was a blinding searchlight on us. We didn't know what that was all about. There was a helicopter with a searchlight. But helicopters didn't exist in 1943, except for some experimental versions. MPs jumped out of someplace, grabbed us, took us to one of the buildings inside on an elevator down several levels. The doors open. We see military and civilian personnel all over the place, a lot of activity, and a man and a civilian in a gray business suit with almost no hair coming over to us and says, "Gentlemen, I've been expecting you. I'm Dr. John von Neumann." So we look at him and says, "You're who?" He said, "We're Dr. John von Neumann." You couldn't be. We left him about an hour or so ago, and he's a much younger man. So he got a little irate, said to us, "Gentlemen, I am the same Dr. von Neumann you knew in 1943. This is not 1943, it's 1983, and you're at Montauk Point, Long Island, at the base that's here. Welcome," or something like that. And we looked at him, and we thought he was nuts, very bluntly. But he says, come with me, I'll give you the cook's tour. So we did. And we saw modern electronic computers. Well, of course, for 1983, the state-of-the-art was IBM 360s and 370s. They had some other specialized computers, and of course, all of the tape drives and everything else that went with the IBM 360s and 370s, the visual displays, etc. We got a quick tour of the underground, and then Von Neumann says, well, I got to take care of something in my office here. Sit down on this lounge here and watch TV until I get back. Okay. So we sit down and watch large screen color TV. Now, of course, that's normal for 1983. But we look at this. What's going on here? So we start watching the programs. And of course, we're discussing Man on the Moon and the Cold War and showing pictures of various things such as the traffic jams and the freeways and all of that. What got to us, though, was the commercials. And one in particular. And that was an advertising commercial for, I think it was American Airlines, which they were saying basically, on your next vacation trip to Hawaii, why not fly with us in our 747 jets? And then, of course, they show a picture of a 747 jumbo jet in flight, which is very standard. We look at this thing. The size of it, jet engines, what's that? The Germans had them in 1943, but we didn't. The British were furiously and feverishly working on them. The Germans had jet engines since about 1940. But there was no commercial jets in that era of 1943. So we look at this and we finally said, maybe the old man's right. So we go find him in his office, and he says, gentlemen, we got a problem. Okay, what's that? He says, well, your ship, locked up with our experiments and our base here, the ship was pulled out into hyperspace, and we can't shut it off. We can shut our equipment off. The two locked together. So we can shut our equipment off, but we can't shut that equipment off from where we are here. You're going to have to go back there and shut the equipment off. Oh? We don't know how we got here. Now, how are we supposed to get back there?
Exactly.
And I said, no problem. It says, here at Montauk, we have complete and total control over space and time. We can send you any place we want at any time we want. So they did. They put us in radiation suits, sent us back literally to the deck of the Eldridge, which was in hyperspace. Of course, for a mathematician, we'll understand what the term hyperspace means, but to the average person, it's a meaningless term because it means you're outside of our normal space and time and a sort of artificial reality which is maintained by literally the equipment and the fields generated by the ship. And he says what is happening is that the field, the hyperspace field is expanding and growing. He says it can be not only kept alive, but it will continue to grow until the ship runs out of equipment or out of fuel or the equipment breaks down. Theoretically, it could run for 30 days, and the thing could get big enough to engulf Earth. You've got to go back there and shut it down. Well, how are we supposed to do that if we even get there? He says, find some axis or whatever else it takes and destroy the equipment. He says, when that equipment is destroyed, it will return to the original location in 1943. So they sent us to the decks of the Eldridge, and we went around, found some axes, started smashing equipment in every direction. They told us there's one piece of equipment you don't touch. And everything else we literally mangled, chopped up, cut cables. And then when the large generators started to wind down, we knew it was essentially over because they had no more power to drive them, so they started to wind down. And at that point, we went back out on deck. That's when we saw 2 sailors buried in the deck.
That's a very interesting story, Dr. Albert. But I would like to ask you first, this hyperspace looks like a frame in the future that you went to 1983. Now, if you went to 1983, which means that the people you are with in 1943 had actually traveled in time 40 years, and you had gone there. Now, the inventions of the future had already been done. The jumbo jet and all the televisions which were in the future had already occurred.
Yes.
Now, which obviously to me would mean that the future is already present. It was already present in 1943. That was in 1983. And so that hyperspace is really a future, is it not? 40 years is a long time. And if you went back to 43, but you had already been in 1983 and seen what was going to happen in the future, now it sort of puzzles the mind that you had a look into the future and it was able to fly back into the past. But together with your manager there, that Mr. Duncan, was it Duncan? You went back and found him still young, and yet you had seen him old. Would you have to give us an idea exactly how you yourself understand it?
Okay, well, that's a good question and a very interesting point of view. One has to explain from what we were taught in terms of the mathematics and such that time is a continuous loop, if you will. It exists, literally, the future time exists, the past time exists, and let us say if you had a car on the proper track or a train on the proper track, you could literally travel from our time to another time, past or future, and see what is going to be, or take a look in the past, go back and see it over again. The time is a continuum, but we live in one particular and specific point, you, I, and everybody here in this room. The reason why we stay referenced to this location in time is because when we're actually not even born, but at the time of let us say, creation, in terms of the fetus, it is locked to the time stream by a set of time locks, which gives that growing, to-be-born individual a reference point on time so that everything is logical and follows through afterwards, and you don't go sliding around on the time stream. Now, if you break those locks, various things can happen, and it did happen in Duncan's case afterwards, 6 months or so later. But you actually exist in the one time. It is theoretically possible, as we found out and Van Neumann did later, to have a kind of machine to change your actual location in the terms of the time stream so that you can go to the future or the past and see how it's going to be or how it was in the past and so forth, and then again return to the point in time where you were. The hyperspace concept is a mathematical concept which really doesn't have a specific relationship to any specific time. It is a sort of reality outside of our normal concepts of reality. It is separate in the sense that we have the three dimensions we recognize and see, plus the dimensions of time, which is fourth dimension, as even Einstein put it. But you also have something else. And this is where, we don't want to go into this too deeply because it's not related to the Philadelphia experiment. You also have parallel realities, which you can go to if you have the proper means for access. Normally we never get to them, never see them. But they're there, and there's parallel realities existing side by side with us. As I understand it from Dr. Triller's work at SRI, there's 7 of them. He went into this some decades ago in the theory of it, but you can go to the future and then you can come back if you know how to travel in time. Or, as in our case, it was not our choice, and we did come back. But it's not specifically hyperspace related. What happened to the ship was that it went into hyperspace, which is an artificial reality due to the equipment it was using plus the lockup with Montauk Point. Therefore, it was out of the normal time stream. As you asked the question how the things appear to us on the ship, they looked perfectly normal as long as you didn't try to penetrate, excuse me, with your view more than about 6 feet beyond the railing. When Duncan and I jumped overboard, of course, we were no longer part of the ship or the ship's field, and what really happened, we still can't explain. Why did we go to 1983? What was the factors? What was the reaction? What caused this? Because we were already outside of the normal time stream, but we wound up in 83. And then, of course, we were sent back to the ship. The ship's equipment was wrecked by us sufficiently. The ship returned in 1943 in the harbor where it was, and the ship reappeared. And then, of course, the Navy had a board of inquiry, and they decided after many days of discussion, they wanted to try the experiment again, to rebuild the equipment, Duncan and I were not part of the second, or should we say in this case, the third experiment. They would put it downriver on station, remove all personnel after the ship's on station, and by remote cables, about 1,500 feet of cable, turn everything on by cable with no one on board ship. So they did this, and ship disappeared. And after about 20 minutes, it came back, and there was a fire, and there was equipment smoking in the core of the ship. The Navy decided that's enough of this, cancel the project, and so forth, repair the ship so it can go to sea. But it had strange effects in terms of what went on that ship, in terms of the other personnel. Those below decks, shielded by the steel, were perfectly okay. They were not affected by it. They didn't even, they sort of felt something strange was going on, but they were not affected physically by it. Those on deck who were there deliberately to observe what was going on, they went, at least by medical examination afterwards, they were considered as insane. They went nuts. I still question whether they were really insane or not, or whether it was because of another event that happened while Duncan and I were missing from the ship. Some of them insisted that there were aliens, extraterrestrials, came on board the ship and went all over the place, and I looked at these guys and the sailors, and eventually left. And the sailors had absolutely no exposure to anything like this. No, at that time one wasn't concerned historically with UFOs and aliens and all of this. And I see these strange-looking creatures running around on the deck. It was enough to drive a guy nuts. But in any case, they were declared insane. And as time went on, those who were okay below decks wound up going back into other parts of the Navy and service elsewhere. Those guys were most basically locked up in the hospitals, the VA hospitals, declared insane, and were kept there for the rest of their lives. They were never let out. Duncan was gone, so they didn't worry about him. I seemed to be sane. I didn't talk about ETs or some other such thing. I didn't see them, and I didn't believe it. Many years later, of course, other things occurred. But at that time, I was removed from that operation. I was used by the Navy for other things. Very briefly, I was 3 years in 1944, July 44 to July 4th, 1947, at Los Alamos Labs at the request of Dr. von Neumann to help him in the atomic bomb project. So I was there during that period of time. And of course, after the war was over, there was a big hassle. Are they going to keep the labs open or not? And of course, Dr. Edward Teller, who was part of the staff, was insisting we're going to go ahead and build the the hydrogen bomb. And he was opposed by a number of people, including myself. And because I got into some very nasty hassles and arguments with him, and quite literally told him his math was flawed, and he didn't like that one bit.
Oh, God, no.
He had quite a temper. I was removed, and it was a political thing. I was removed from the lab and sent to the Pentagon, worked on many other projects up until 1953, when somebody, whether in the Navy or not, I don't know, decided I knew too much and had to be removed, and let's say the life of Edward Cameron terminated.
Yes, that is another interesting part. But before you go to that, I would like to ask another question before we leave the experiment. Mm-hmm. Is it possible that that the changing, alternating electromagnetic waves that change they create the invisibility, or the visibility of the ship to invisibility, was actually also changing the vibrations of the atoms of the ship, or molecules of the ship, changing their vibration, like it also changed the human being's vibration, mm-hmm. and then transmuting them into that state of invisibility, which is now a science that some people think is sort of a relationship between the physical and the spiritual, mm-hmm. that you change the vibration of the physical, and then it becomes pure spirit vibration. Is that to sort of relate the spirit to the physical, and that is possibly a scientific fact according to the experiment that you did. Could you just elaborate a little on that?
Okay. What you're saying, in essence, talking about the physical level and the spiritual level, can in a way be explained by considering alternate realities. The people who physically die here, their soul goes someplace. It goes, from what I now understand, and we certainly didn't then, is going to another reality where everything is physical to them, but not to us, because they're in a totally different vibrational field, if you will, and they can communicate back and forth. But in terms of what happened to those sailors, the vibrations that affected them, the change in the fields of the ship and so forth, have had very strong and severe effects on their, let us say, their mentality, their reality, and that may have in itself already have driven them crazy. But another thing happened I haven't mentioned yet. Of those who were stationed on the deck during the experiment, as that ship came back, some of them started to literally fade out of our reality, out of our visibility. They faded out and became invisible. They came back. When they faded out to be invisible, it wasn't a case of just being invisible. They were no longer there on the deck of the ship. They kept coming in and out, fading in and out from another reality. Well, the sailors who did not do this, they didn't all go into this phase. A bunch of others, about 6 others, jumped overboard and disappeared. We never saw them again. I mean, they did go in bananas. Couldn't take it. Those who were left on the decks there did somehow intuitively get the idea to keep these guys in our reality, lay on your hands on them, so that the physical vibes of those who had not changed and gone through this invisibility mode or shifting into another reality, if you take them and hold them on your hands on their shoulders and have a closed loop circle, they'd stayed in our reality. Well, the scientists and the physicists who came on board after this and saw this problem, and the medical people who saw this problem knew they had a very serious problem. They did solve it. About 6 months of research, they found some way of building a little black box which would keep these guys stable on this reality so they didn't shift out and disappear. So that was one of the reasons why the project was classified very highly, and there's never acknowledged at any time afterwards as ever having existed. They had so many problems from this thing. The Navy and those in the brass and in the medical corps and the scientific groups didn't know what to do, quite literally. But the analogy there of the time fields and the time reference, the individuals, yes, an individual can travel through time if you have the right hardware. Now, speaking theoretically, a person with the right spiritual mind and attunement should be able to travel by, let us say, manipulation of the body fields through time without having any of the cumbersome hardware which is required. I mean, it's theoretically. I'm not saying that anyone can do it, but theoretically they should be able to, and I suspect there are people who have solved that. The invisibility aspect is something else you would solve at the same time. I know of one person who claims they can do that transference and jump around a lot, not so much change time as change physical location consciously without getting in a car and driving there or some other conveyance. But there's a lot of strange things happened, and because of that the project was canceled and scrapped. After the war was over, the Navy came back to von Neumann and says, "We'd like to have you reopen this project. See if you can find out what really went wrong, and is there anything salvageable from the project. Maybe you can find some way to make it work properly." So he was given this assignment in 1947, and he went on it, and I was assigned to him after a while. And we worked on that roughly from about 48 to 51, as I was part of it. And we did find another approach. And it is still classified, but they found a totally different way to approach the problem of invisibility, where you did not get the tremendous interaction with the physical body, where you could make an object of any size literally invisible, and you would not have an interaction between them and the people who were there. It required, among other things, the development of the computer, the modern electronic digital stored memory computer, because that was what made the electronic calculator different. Where you put a stored memory in it, then it's a computer, because you can go through all these interactions, as you may well understand. All of these programs and interactions pre-programmed to do a certain series and sequence of events so that you come out with the answer you want at the end. And the older calculators, which we had during World War II, the ENIAC and the others, for every single calculation, you then, to do another one, you had to change the cables and the connections manually. It was very cumbersome. They got some answers, but it was nothing like when von Neumann came up with the answer for a computer, that you could pre-program the thing to do all kinds of things. And so he did. He developed one. The first one, the first working model, went in the museum of the Smithsonian. The second one went to the Navy with the whole system, which was tested on board the aircraft carrier, the Midway. There was no problems, no sick sailors, no side reactions, and that, of course, the Navy liked. And from that point on, we've had the system, and it's been used, and with no more psychological or physiological bad effects, it was usable. What exactly changed, I couldn't even tell you now, the whole system, even though I worked on it, because a lot of that memory is lost, and what parts I do remember are still classified, so I can't really go into that. But it was a totally new approach, and it worked, that we can say.
Oh, could you, being that you know the events that are now about to come, before go back to the part where the government of the United States wanted you to maybe shut you up for some time, but before we go to that part, I would like to ask you to tell us whether you have been writing a little bit about, a lot, in fact, about the coming star, Nibiru, and that it will come and that it will create a very powerful magnetic reinteraction between the sun and the earth and itself. And of course, why I ask this is because of the powerful electromagnetic forces that will be in operation at that time. It would transmute a lot of things into the dimensions that you have been talking about, the Philadelphia experiment. And since we also have heard about the Bermuda Triangle, where ships have been disappearing, whether that's a reality or not, but it seems sort of similar to the events of 1943 and what is going to happen in this particular phase of 2003 when another planet comes and loops around the sun and creates the devastation that is being feared at this time. Would you tell us something about that?
Yes. Planet X, it has been variously called, Nibiru, whatever, is on a very strange cycle. Every 3,660 years approximately, it comes into our solar system and passes the Earth, sometimes close, sometimes rather far away. This is all verified historically by various records. But it's coming in, or let us say was coming in, and the period of time which had been postulated for its close passage by the Earth was sometime in May of 2003, which is to say less than 2 months away. And it was spotted not only by telescope, but NASA got into the act on this back in 1987-88. They had used 2 of the satellites which they had sent out to quite literally pinpoint where it was and how far out it was outside of our solar system. They did find it, and actually they located it originally in 1987. It was an item in the Los Angeles Times and probably elsewhere, Planet X found. This was in 1987, because I remember seeing this headlines. Yes. But this was for the, shall we say, the advanced scientists who were able to locate it. And it's been coming on in since. Let me explain something about its cycles of operation, if you want to put it that way. It is a planetary body, or appears to be a planetary body, and the early photos show it as a near-dead dying star, glowing red, so forth. It's not a star at all. This is, shall we say, disguise, or a cover-up put out by those who are on Nibiru to disguise what they are. But it goes in a very strange orbit. It's a circular figure-8 orbit between two suns, our sun and the other one. We're a binary star system, which is not well known, but NASA knows it, and it has leaked to some extent. The other sun is about 60 billion miles away, and it's quite dead, quite cold. It has some planets around it. But Nibiru, for whatever reason, has been locked in this crazy figure-8 orbit. When it gets near the other sun, of course, like a slingshot effect, it's accelerated, pulled around the sun, and then goes back out and crosses out and eventually gets to our sun. And again is accelerated like in a slingshot effect. Well, some other strange things have happened in the meantime. I really don't know how much I should go into on this, but I do know that there was an invitation. Nibiru is inhabited. It has been known to be for some time. Sitchkin was the first to talk about this some years ago with his book, The 12th Planet, he called it. Well, that's by his enumeration. It's actually called the 10th planet by the way we count at this time. And it was known that what was known about it, of course, historically was it was in this figure-8 orbit. It would come in and pass the Earth eventually. And they plotted the early orbit on this, showing it would pass the Earth, but they weren't quite sure how close. The fears have been expressed that if it's close enough, it's going to stop the Earth in its rotation for perhaps 3 days, and then when it resumes rotation, possibly flip geographically, or if not geographically, flip the poles magnetically. This was the concern, and that would cause enormous disruptions, of course, flooding and so on. The Russian study made in 1990, which was published openly in Pravda, and as part of the book you were showing around here a little earlier, the Russians concluded that if it comes by in the same distance from the planet Earth as in the past passes, it would probably wipe out 90% of Earth's population and do terrible devastation to our society and our civilization and the planet. That was the fear, and of course it has been the fear. It has done damage in the past, sometimes relatively little, every 1600 plus years, other times devastating. It goes back about 250,000 years it has been doing this figure-8 program, and it would appear that this object, this planet, whatever you want to call it, has been locked in this orbit for at least that long, 250,000 years. Well, what has turned up is rather interesting. We have developed, or have found would be a more appropriate term, in the meantime, since, let's say, the time of the last passing, various things, among them the Stargate. I don't know if you're familiar with the Stargate theory, the Stargates, which the United States government has at least 2. One of them was recovered from the Chaco Canyon repository put there by the Wingmakers in the 8th century AD. It was discovered in 1994, where they got into the 24 rooms, there's 24, not 3, and recovered a lot of technical hardware, including a Stargate, which we've been using. We finally found out how to make it work. They've taken trips to Nibiru.
Taking trips to
Yes, physically.
Nibiru.
Physically, with the Stargate. I talked with the inhabitants, those who run it. There's more than one level. You have what you might call the ruling class, the ruling elite, which are 7-foot-plus tall blackberry people, very intelligent, very sharp, and apparently very hospitable. But they were not entirely sure they wanted to let the crew who got there, at their invite yet, return to Earth. Well, they did. There's been several more trips. And from what I understand, they have made an agreement. We would supply them with what they said was their equipment was burned out. They've been trapped in this orbit. They have no control whatever, except a very minor control, over where the 10th planet goes. It's trapped in this orbit and has been for a long time. Well, they were told, we can rebuild your equipment, but on condition that, number one, no more eating of human flesh. We'll supply you with porkers, it tastes the same. So there's been thousands of porkers shipped up there. And number two, we will control your orbit and where you go, and it said eventually when the equipment is repaired and so forth, as long as you leave us in control, we'll take you through the solar system and you will go out the other side and you'll never come back to the solar system, period.
Now, who was dictating that?
American groups that are involved in this research and in the control. I know one or two of the people specifically. I'm not free to talk about who they are. But they agreed to this according to what I've been told. Therefore, the first thing that happened when they got any equipment functioning, they deviated 15 degrees from the original trajectory. So they're no longer coming in as direct as is expected. NASA finally stuck their neck out, and I don't know how public the statement is, but they said it will pass Earth in the period between the year 2005 and 2007, if it passes Earth at all. So it's not going to go by, so far anything I know of, it's not going to go by in May of this year close to the Earth. It'll be sometime, maybe 2 years from now. And how close is another guess. It may not be close at all. If it was in the ordinary, and let us say the original trajectory as predicted, we'd be able to see it plainly now because it'd be close enough to be able to see it. It would be well inside the Pluto orbit. It would be approaching probably Jupiter or further in than that, and you would see it as a nightly growing star which would become brighter and bigger every night, because if it's going to pass the Earth, let's say in mid-May, you would plainly see it with the naked eye now. You wouldn't even need a telescope. And it was below the plane of the ecliptic, the southern plane if you will. It should by now, according to the original trajectory, be in the northern plane of the ecliptic. It's in the, let's say, the upper plane of the ecliptic, the northern hemisphere, if you will, somewheres. But I don't know if anybody has seen it except in a telescope, and you have to know where to look to find it. So it is way behind the expected schedule. And while it may well still be coming in, it is not coming in at the predicted rate. It has changed direction. It actually stopped its forward motion for a period of time, which of course made a big delay. That is known in certain circles. And we're not sure really where it's going to go, but if it goes past the Earth, it's probably going to be about 2 years from now. Yes, it may still pass the Earth, but if they are, and as I've been told, if they are controlling it, it's not going to come by very close, if at all. In other words, they don't want any more disruptions of the planet Earth, particularly when we have a very high order civilization at the present time, with techniques, technology, and advanced science, which is beyond most people's wildest imaginings. We used to talk in the comic strips about Buck Rogers in the 25th century. That's so far behind schedule, behind the things that are really going on. And the more advanced technology and science that we have today, which the public never hears about and is kept very classified, would literally curl people's eyebrows, if I may put it that way. We have technology which is beyond some people's wildest dreamings. We have, let us say, the means today for all unlimited energy, free energy, and so forth from sources other than the usual thermal types and all of that which we have been dependent upon for so long. We have modes of travel which are beyond wildest expectations. We have already solved the problems of anti-gravity due to the back engineering of UFOs, whether you want to accept that or not. Of course, UFOs have been seen all over Europe, all over America, all over the world, over the last period of time, let's say primarily from 1947 onward, though there were some that came down prior to that. And Europe was deluged with UFOs between 1941 and 43. I've seen the newspaper clippings, which a German person I know saved and showed me, and she knew the whole story. So there's been many UFOs, many have crashed, been brought down, and we've back engineered practically everything they ever accomplished, and then gone on our own. In detail, I can't tell you, I don't know all the details. But we have technology, therefore there is a concern. We don't want this planet wrecked at this particular junction in history. Like in the past, Atlantis had a very high order of civilization. It was destroyed. The continent sank for whatever reasons.
By the same process, I suppose?
Yeah, something caused it. But these sort of things are of concern, and insofar as Nibiru is concerned, I don't think, in my own opinion, from what I know, we need to worry about it. Yes, we want to keep it under observation.
there is a website, I think, which shows something like a comet going around the sun, and that is going to approach Earth from the southern,
Yes,
from the South Pole,
from the southern hemisphere.
southern hemisphere. Then what are those people showing? Like a comet-like thing with a long tail, and it's heading towards us. Are you acquainted with that?
Oh, I know what you're talking about, yes. That's totally separate from Nibiru. There was a large cometary body that came in. It has been dubbed with the name the Neat Comet.
Yeah.
And it also has a classified number, a classification by number and so forth, which I have in my notes somewheres. It's a huge comet. It's the largest that's ever been seen. It's 168,000 miles in diameter. It's larger than Jupiter by about twice the diameter of Jupiter. It has come in. It's already around the sun. It didn't pass near the Earth at all, but it's close enough that because of the mass of that object, it caused us some very heavy weather disturbances for about a week or two. Really wild weather disturbances. It is, from what I have been told and what I have seen of pictures of it on the internet, it is in orbit now around the sun. And nobody knows for sure whether it's just going to flip out the other side or whether it's going to take up a permanent residence around the sun. I think it's a little bit unknown at this point. But yes, it's been seen and known, and it is a huge thing.
Thank you very much, Dr. Alpe. There is another aspect of this phenomenon. We know that the Earth being suspected to be hollow, and there are certain civilizations in the inside of the Earth that have been operating on the surface, and some are suspecting that these are the people, that the civilization which is far advanced inside there with their own sun are the ones that actually make the flying saucers that have been classified as UFOs visiting Earth. Could you throw some light on that? Maybe they are the ones who are also collaborating with the Earth people to connect with the Nibiru. Is that a possibility?
Well, I didn't know that you were into the inner Earth. I've been reading about it and studying it for years, and I've read all of the various stories. I was one of the, shall we say, members of the group of Ivan Sanderson when he was alive. He was a Britisher, and he was an animal expert and naturalist, and he got into the theories of the hollow Earth and the inner Earth. And he studied, to go back in history to about the beginning of the 20th century, the Amundsen expedition up to the North Pole, in which he reported he was sort of going over a lip, he was sort of going downhill, the sun was getting very strange, it was getting so warm he had to take his winter suit off because it was getting too hot. There were plants there and so forth, indicating a warmer climate. But he never went the rest of the way, so to speak. He panicked out or whatever and turned around and went back when he made his report. There are other reports, of course. If you go back into the history of Antarctica, and what is now very hard to find, in 1938 and 39, the Germans made expeditions to Antarctica based on information they had, and they claimed under international law at that time a very large segment of Antarctica, 600,000 square kilometers, and called it New Schwabenland. And in it, it had a warm lake, warm and free of ice the year round. And they went in there and they made their secret bases there, and that gets into a whole problem in 1947 with Admiral Byrd, who went down there to, quote, quash the last of the Nazi resistance, unquote. It took 6 weeks for them to for the expedition of Byrd to be thrown out by the Germans. But in that time period, when he was there, that 6 weeks, Byrd heard about the inner Earth thing, and he was invited with several of the planes they had. They brought down 7 DC-2s, I think they were, or DC-3s. They flew them in, had their airfields for them, and they went around mapping Antarctica. But he was invited to come into the inner Earth, to fly in through the hole in the South Pole, gave him directions and so forth. And there were 3 planes, I think, that went on the trip. They were told, under no circumstances do you fire on anything you may see or anyone you may see. You do not take any kind of military action. You don't fire on them and so forth. You're invited in as a peaceful invite. So he flew in, and the other craft that went with him saw these German craft, which looked like almost an upended bottle, with the standard Iron Cross insignia on the side of the craft. Yes, of the old German fleet. And of course, this is what they went down there to find. So they started firing on these guys, and they wound up being grounded, literally shot down. But they got into the inner Earth, and they were invited to a conference. And the conference was inner Earth people, the Americans and others who came as part of that expedition, and a whole group of aliens who were there to confer with Byrd and took a message back. He says, you take a message back to your government. He says, if you don't start straightening out the way you're treating the Earth, you're going to wind up and not even have one. He says, you're destroying it the way you're going, at the rate you're going. So they had the meeting. He was gone about 24 hours, and they flew back out, just the one craft, his, and landed. And they asked him, where have you been? What's going on here? They didn't think he'd ever come back because he was gone about 27 hours, and he only had about fuel enough, I understand, from reading the notes, of about 17 hours. He was 10 hours overdue. Of course, the public never heard the whole story. I happen to know his nephew, who showed me the notes, and told me the story as his uncle told him. And of course, he was picked up by the Navy, thrown in the hospital at, what was the name of that? Navy hospital down in Maryland. Put in the insane ward. I was told, if you ever want to get out, you will renounce the story and never talk about it again. So we finally agreed, after about 6 months, that he would be let free. He would never talk about the story again or what happened when he was at the South Pole. So he was returned to active duty in the Navy, and of course 10 years later they had the IGY two-year thing of exploring the South Pole, and he went on that expedition, but under different circumstances. But he insisted on there is a hollow earth, there is an interior there, and many of the Germans, the former Nazis, had gone into the inner earth from perhaps New Schwabenland, and were part of the civilization there, and allegedly had built railroads and improved their status in the interior of the earth, and done some things for them, and built this new city called New Berlin, which I am told confidentially has an actual embassy in Washington, D.C., if you know where to look for it. I don't, I was not told where it is. There's a lot of strange things going on which tie back to the inner earth. How long has that civilization been there? The rumors are going on for centuries, literally, that there's a civilization in the inner earth, and there perhaps are other levels of civilization as you make your way down, because the stories that have been told, mostly considered fiction, but apparently not fiction, are that as you go down to get through to where the inner earth hollow section is, where everything's sort of inside out, and there is a central sun, there are other civilizations in between, in these very large caverns, extremely large caverns. I don't know if it's a fact or not, but those stories persist. So there's a lot going on that we don't understand, and many people will not accept it. And many scientists don't accept it. But very definitely there is an inner earth, and people ask, how can it be? Science says there's a molten core. There has to be a molten core to create the magnetic field. Not necessarily. There is no molten core as such, and they go on the theory that as you go down in depth below the Earth's crust in a mine, the temperature rises at a rather uniform rate. In the vicinity of the mines, that is true, but they're forgetting something else. I'm a spelunker. I've done cave exploring in the past. If you go in the natural caverns, it doesn't matter where you are on Earth, you go down in the natural caverns, whatever depth you go to, the temperature is a constant 52 degrees Fahrenheit, the year round, regardless of where you are. The natural caverns are a constant temperature. You have volcanic hotspots, which are not fully explainable, but they exist, of course. You do not have a molten core, you have this hollow core, and the theoretical explanations of how can this be goes back into, let us say, astrophysics and some of the newer theories. When a body like the Earth, or any planetary body, starts out It's a gaseous body. It has its own internal circulations, these gases from the surface to the interior and so forth. Eventually it starts to cool. And as it starts to cool, it will liquefy. But the flow, which is created at the beginning of the gases and so forth, which in a sense resemble a Klein bottle, it literally goes inside and outside and over and around and creates a very strange structure. It winds up with a hole in the center. And as it solidifies, that hole stays there. It doesn't disappear. And a solid body is created with a hole in the interior and with entrances from either, basically from either pole. And the one big problem and aspect here, which I can't adequately explain, is yes, we have this structure. We can say there's a hollow earth. The pole should be, the hollow pole should be readily visible at any time. They're not. They only seem to be visible and accessible periodically.
The hole.
The hole. That's right, because there's been many pictures taken of the North Pole and the South Pole, and there's no hole there, but occasionally it shows a hole. Now, years ago, there was a magazine published by a gentleman up in Wisconsin, I remember his name, Ray Palmer. As first was Astounding Science Fiction, then he had another series of magazines he did, but he investigated this thing, and on one of his magazine covers he showed the picture of the hole in the North Pole. He says he can't explain it, you don't see it all the time, but he got the picture of it when one time it was open. Whether it's on a lunar phase or what, I don't know, but it's on some kind of a rotating phase where occasionally it's open and the rest of the time it's not. And you will not get into the interior if it's not open physically as we understand it.
There was a program sometime recently, and they were showing some pictures of Earth as taken from space, from outer space. And they showed the blue planet, Earth, with a hole at the north, and it was obviously, a black hole, indicating that there could be something really there. And they didn't mention anything about it. During the commentary, they were talking about cloud movements around, but never said anything about the hole, which indicated that they didn't want to say anything about it because there was no explanation that was acceptable by maybe the authorities that want to control the information about it. But they say that maybe all the planets are hollow anyway, and that the moon is hollow. That as the explanation that the physical formation of these planets actually requires that sort of formation because of the physics of it. But maybe they don't want us to know about the civilizations inside there. But at the same time, we would want to continue with the original story, to conclude it with your part where the government of the United States wanted to shut you up and keep you silent about the events of 1943 concerning the invisibility. Could you tell us about that?
Yes. Yeah, to leave off from the other story and explanations. I was still in the Navy. I was a captain. I had a family. They wouldn't let me see the family after 1947. I snuck one secret trip to them, which the Navy never did say anything about, because I was on travel. But they decided, after a number of things had happened, tried to start up a new business and industry, which the military at first approved with, and I had a partner, and then they decided they wanted to destroy it. But I became in a very strange position. I not only had the PhD in physics, but I was classified as something of a more than a normal genius, and the way I helped von Neumann and others solve problems. There was two problems they were facing. One, I knew too much about various projects and things, and they were afraid at some point I might talk. Two, I might go out on my own, leave the Navy, and do things on my own as an organization, because at that time my father was alive, and apparently he had access to virtually unlimited funds for financing. Father since died. He was in '85 when he passed on. My real father, I mean. And they decided I knew too much, B, I was a nuisance. C, I was a sort of troublemaker. I did open my mouth a lot. I wasn't one of those people silently let things pass by. I had to have my say about it, and I did more than once. They decided they had to get rid of me, but at the same time, they couldn't get rid of me. The problem was this. I had traveled in time. I was part of a time loop, a particular one from 43 to 83, which was troublesome because Dr. Norman Levinson, who was from MIT and created the time matrix and the time formulas and the whole set of time mathematics, said that due to the fact that the Philadelphia experiment in 43 locked up with Montauk in 83, it created a rift in space-time 40 years wide, which would take, according to his mathematics, another 20 years to settle down, in other words, till August of 2003. And he said, in the meantime, there has to be some means of stabilizing this thing because the rift was unstable, and you can go into electromagnetic theory and show a number of things about damping factors and all of this, but it created a disturbance in the time field which had to be stabilized, and there was no physical electromagnetic way known to do this. And it seems like I was part of the stabilization, Duncan was part of the stabilization, John von Neumann was, and a few others perhaps. We provided the stabilization, and we had to be kept alive because of that. But at the same time, the Navy wanted to get rid of me because of the other factors that I was a nuisance to them, if you will. So they finally came up in late July, perhaps, into August, with a solution. The solution was, yes, I'll be kept alive, but first they would run me through a system whereby they strip me of all of my memories, make me completely blank of my whole life as Edward Cameron. And secondly, they would age regress me physically down to a baby size, let's say something like about 9 months old. And C, put me into the past in another family and arranged for me to be adopted. Whereas there was, as a fact, there was a real Al Beilik who had a real birth certificate, but apparently he got ill, or that's the story that was given to my legal parents. He got ill and went back to the hospital and died. So with the Al Beilik, the real one, dead, they could put me in as a substitute, an adopted substitute, which was known to my legal parents at that time. And then they sort of manipulated their memories so they would forget the fact that I was an adopted kid. And of course I had no memory of my own at that point, and therefore I didn't know anything of my real past. So I grew up, first memory was in Christmas of 1927, literally sitting on top of my mother's grand piano next to a miniature Christmas tree, and most of the family around the piano talking, exchanging presents and all of this.
How old were you then?
Approximately 9 months. I have to say approximately because Al Beilik was born by birth certificate as 31 March 1927. And I was moved in as an 8 or 9 month old baby, and I was filled in there, and that was my first memory, was that Christmas party. I grew up not knowing anything else, and had the usual childhood memories. The one thing which was outstanding at that time, it took years to remember the incident, but at the time of that Christmas party, all of these relatives and friends were talking. I understood everything they said. Now, what kid at 9 months understands the language? There was a major discrepancy. A few things dropped out, like sentences would drop out for some reason, but the rest of it I remembered. And I eventually recalled the fact that I had remembered and that I knew what the language was that early on. When I grew up physically, there were all kinds of strange discrepancies. I was 6'1" at the age of 12, and my legs and torso were not of proper proportions. It was all legs, and the photos show it still, because I have the photos. Eventually I grew up, finished high school, went in the Navy, in World War II again, 1945. I was in the Navy a year and went out, and I was not an officer, I was merely a technician, aviation electronics technician. And came back, tried my own business and failed. Went into other operations. Eventually I went to school, moved to California, finished my schooling. became an electronic engineer, which I was primarily as a consultant, traveling all over the country for 30 years, from 1958 to 1988. And it was in '88 where I saw the famous movie, The Philadelphia Experiment, one Saturday night on TV, which jogged my memory. I had no memory to that point of the fact that I was involved in the Philadelphia Experiment. I had a passionate interest in it for years, for decades, in fact. But I had no idea that I was involved in it. But I knew something was driving me, and I had a great deal of interest in UFOs and various other things which were out of the norm. I was considered a very good engineer, but finally that January of '88 on a Saturday night I saw the movie for the first time. I did not see it, went around through the movie houses, which only lasted 2 or 3 weeks, which was 1984, August of '84. So I saw it that night because the first 15 minutes was very close to the reality of what actually happened. The first 15 minutes were well portrayed. And they showed that I had 2 friends in the Navy, actually brothers, myself and Duncan. But in any case, the portrayal was sufficiently accurate that it jogged my memories. Before the movie was over, saying I was part of that thing. I know I was. But it took another 2 or 3 days before, let's say, the pieces started to fall into place. Number 1, hey, I was married. B, my name was Cameron. Yeah, I had a kid. And, oh yes, John Von Neumann was the head of the project. And he made me a promise before I faded out in that strange equipment at Montauk Point they put me in. He promised me that if I ever remembered being part of the Philadelphia Experiment, he would phone me within 72 hours. It took him 48. Now don't ask me how he knew. I could not begin to tell you. But he didn't get through to me because he didn't know where I was living. At that time I was in Scottsdale, Arizona. And he was still on the East Coast. He went to a friend of his he knew very well, Preston Nichols. I asked him, he says, do you know where I was living? He said, yeah. So in fact, I know where he's working. I can call him. It was during the day. I was at a small company then known as Vidavit Technology in Scottsdale. They're since out of business. That day I was in the lab doing various things in the project all day. And the secretary was supposed to deliver phone messages, put a note on your desk, didn't bother that day for whatever reason, or lack of reason. She didn't put any notes at all on my desk. So I didn't know somebody was trying to call me. So I get home that night, Preston calls and says, hey, where were you all day? I says, no lab. Well, didn't your secretary put a note on your desk, or probably a couple of notes, saying that I was trying to call you? He says, no. He says, do you have any idea who was trying to get a hold of you? No, I don't have the slightest idea who might have been trying to get a hold of me. He says, John Von Neumann. I about went through the floor because I remembered that he had promised to call me or try to call me. So he did. He at least tried. I did meet him later. And he lived in as a recluse, upstate New York, and he's dead now as of the summer of 2001.
No, but there is something there which I can't figure out.
Okay.
You had been regressed in age and to the age of 8 months.
8 or 9
and
months.
he hadn't been regressed, had he? Because then you'd be a very big discrepancy between your age, at the time we contacted. I mean, you had gone to 8 months old, and he had stayed at the age at which you had operated. How did the age link up? What age did you find him at?
Him?
Yeah.
He was at the age he should have been at.
Which one?
Which at that time was, let's see, 88. He would have been about approximately 86. At
86.
that time. Yeah.
And
when I did meet him, he was a very old man with almost no hair.
And how old were you then?
How old was I then? I was at the age that would have correlated with Beilik, Al Beilik, which was, theoretically, he was born in 1927. So this was 88.
From
87. No, I would have been 61 as Al Beilik.
Born in
Well, I was supposedly born in 1927. That's what the birth certificate says. I was
but
age
this
regressed.
second rebirth.
So I literally started life over.
The rebirth of 8 months At which year were you made 8 months old?
Oh, that was in 1953.
53. So from 53,
I was sent backwards in time
yeah,
to the family in 27, and then grew up from the point of 1927 forward.
or you were sent back to
Yes, I was sent back in time into another
by the
family.
machines?
By whoever was running this system, yes. I have no idea how it was all done. I only know that's what happened.
Why, maybe you were cloned in from the adult Alberic, a clone was made young and grew another Alberic.
That's a theory, but I don't consider that as realistic. Another thing occurred, a year and a half before my legal mother, Albertina Beilik, died. She broke her leg, wound up in the hospital.
Mm-hmm.
I was out of town on a trip doing my electronics thing. And I came back to town. She wasn't home, and neighbor says, "Oh, she's in the hospital." I said, "What's she doing there?" "Oh, she broke her leg. She's recuperating." She said, "Okay." So I went over to see her in the hospital. She was very happy to see me and all of that. She'd been through quite a mess with a broken hip. And she was recuperating. They gave her a bone splice and said she'd be probably walking again. She never did really walk properly. But in the hospital bed, looking around there, I see this bag of blood, which they're dripping into her veins. They were giving her transfusions. Said on the bag, on the label, Albertina Beilik, ... blood type A. I said, blood type A. Whoa, wait a minute, what's going on here? I'm not blood type A, I'm O. My brother Duncan is O. My brother over here is O. And insofar as I know, father was O, but I've never been able to find the records as to what father's blood type was. My real father, that is. There's a big discrepancy here. There's all kinds of discrepancies show up when you start looking hard enough and far enough. I was not blood type A. Now,
It turned out to be O.
yes,
After.
I was O. Now, originally, as Ed Cameron, I really don't know what my blood type was. It would have been taken, noted someplace, but I cannot find any legal records of Edward Cameron. Only thing I ever found was a picture in the yearbook from Princeton in 1936 showing me there.
Do the pictures look like you?
Yes, it does. It resembles me.
Like you now?
Not exactly, but it resembles me. And of course, the picture was taken in 1936 when I would have been 1916. Would have been the age of 20, because I finished school early and did my 4 years of college. I was 20 years old then. It looked a lot like me. There's a resemblance. Also, the pictures of my real father that compare with me now is a close resemblance.
When you went to university again, Dr. Alberic, you did the same courses like you had done before as Cameron?
No, as Cameron was in physics, as Beilik was in engineering, electronic engineering.
Did you have any idea that you had studied these subjects before, any of these subjects?
No, at that time I did not. I only knew that I just fell into this sort of thing and it sort of fitted and so on, but I had no recollection of having been to school prior to that, or having gone through a whole schooling system prior. That only came back when I finally remembered the fact that it was Ed Cameron and the education. That all didn't come back in one shot. It came back over a period of time, quite a period of time, in fact. But eventually the pieces all started to come back together and fell together, even memories of Ed Cameron when I was living in the big house in Long Island, the 26-room mansion, and one of the Christmas parties there. In fact, it's a very curious coincidence. I remembered, the first thing I remembered as Al Beilik was his Christmas party in 1927 with the folks, which was in Jamaica. There was another Christmas party as Ed Cameron in 1927 on Long Island. And I remember that one. And Father would typically, he was then still in the Navy, he would typically show up around Christmas time, take a couple of weeks leave, and show up to see the family, Duncan and myself, and the rest of the family. The rest of the memories as Cameron are, some of them are a little weak. They're not fully there, we'll put it that way.
Dr. Alberic, Your story is extremely interesting. But have you ever considered going to see a person who can hypnotize you?
Yes, and I'm not hypnotizable.
You are not?
No.
Because it would have been interesting to find out how he could regress your memory, to find out what you've gone through.
Believe it or not, they did that with Duncan, because Duncan today is in a new body, and he had a lot of problems from being through the Montauk Project, and they took him through hypnosis. And everything seemed normal for him up down to the age of 12. And they said, go back further. And he found himself on the decks of the Eldridge, and he says, hey, I'm on some crazy ship called the Eldridge, and there are people here I know today, has different names. So he says, one of them is Al Beilik. And he says, I know him, he was here on the Eldridge. He did this under hypnosis. Now, he was hypnotizable.
But then he recognized you as Al Beilik?
Yes.
On the ship?
He didn't know me as Al Beilik on the ship. He said there are people here on the ship whom I know, one of them whom I know today as Al Beilik.
I see. So that ties up with a new identity from Cameroon to Al Beilik.
Yeah.
At least that's a piece of evidence that you are one and the same person.
Yes.
Which is very interesting.
One of the things I need to do, and I've yet to do, is do a DNA test match between Duncan and myself, because he's available. I don't know if Father ever had a DNA test made or not, because he didn't do DNA testing when he was in the Navy. Long since, yes. Whether any DNA samples exist of him anywhere, I don't know, because he died in 1985. And it'll probably be invalid unless they've been kept in cryogenic deep freeze. There are some other people, basically my brother, because we know that he is a Cameron legally and all of that, and is physically a Cameron. That is perhaps the one way I can still check to find out, yeah, am I really a Cameron or not? I mean, to put it bluntly to the test, am I the same blood type as Ed Cameron, or am I otherwise?
Have you got one birth certificate or two?
I'm sorry?
Do you have one birth certificate or two birth certificates?
One, as Al Beilik. I could never find the one for Edward Cameron. I tried. I actually went through the motions in a archives in Long Island. They found the birth certificate for my father and gave me a copy, and I said, is there a birth certificate there for Ed Cameron? He said, there should be. And he looked and he says, no. He says, in those days, there was no guarantee there would be a birth certificate, because very often, back in those days, which was 1916, they didn't bother to file with the health department. They kept the records in their home Bible, which was very typical. He said, it's only in recent years that it's required that everybody have a birth certificate from the Department of Health. So that didn't prove anything one way or the other of itself. It merely said that they couldn't find a birth certificate for Edward Cameron. Father, yes, they had it. They found it.
Dr. Albey, just the last question. You have given us a lot of very valuable information. I wonder whether you have added information of that nature onto your website, because a lot of our listeners and viewers are going to be looking for your website, which I'm going to ask you to give on this microphone so that they can look at it for the background to your work and to see what they can find about you, as you are a very remarkable person. I think you are here for the reason at this present time in the history of this planet.
Yes, that's an interesting statement of itself that you put it that way. I've had a website. My computer crashed, and I won't go over the details, but the computer's still down. I do have another one, which I did not have time to set up before I came here. I'll give you a website that will be. I'm changing websites for a reason. I'm changing the name. It will be PhiladelphiaExperiment.com. The Philadelphia Experiment, there will be a hyphen between them, because I chose to do it that way because it gives it broader coverage. So it'll be Philadelphia-Experiment.com. My original one was albeilik.com. I have a website which is also down now, but will be restored as it was, which is albeilik@juno.com. Juno being Juno. That will restore as it was. It's been down so long it's defunct right now, but too many computer problems and other problems. I'll get that straightened out after I get back, which will be Wednesday. I'll be going back 2 days from now. But it will be up, I would say, within a week, 10 days after I'm back. And you can find it as PhiladelphiaExperiment.com for the website, and email as albeilik@juno.com.
Thank you very much, Dr. Albeck, and we are very, very thankful for the time you've spared to give us this information, which is going to be of great value to our viewers all over, because this video or recording is going to be going to so many places, so many countries beyond your expectation. Thank you very much, Dr. Albeck.
Thank you
very much.
Thank you.
Mr. Beilik. Can I come close to you and see my face on the camera with you?
Okay.
He's a good man, man. Yeah. Thank you.
I'm just hoping that telling what I know about the Stargate business
That was
and the
interesting.
visit to Nibiru doesn't cause major problems.
Why should it? Why
I-
should it?
It won't.
It shouldn't.
It would never.
It's because you have revealed it. Now it's too late to do anything about it. You see, the best defense is to say what they didn't want you to say. But
Yes.
now you've said it.
Yeah.
It's useless.
Right. No, I have a lot of connections and a lot of people, because over all these years I've
Sorry.
made a lot of friends and a lot of connections, and the data I get is incredible. And I've talked about a number of these things openly on the phone. I've never been reprimanded. I've had the phone line cut off a couple of times. It just mysteriously goes dead. So you redial it and you reconnect. But nobody's ever come to me and said, I can't talk about this, I can't talk about that. And waiting to see what happens over this one.
I just wanted to show you some
Yeah.
some inhabitants of Nibiru. And I
Inhabitants of...
want- Nibiru,
Oh,
the black people you saw yourself personally?
no, I was not there.
Okay.
I've remote viewed it, but I have not been there physically.
These are one of the people.
Yeah, they were...
Big-eyed black people, very big
Yeah,
eyes.
yes, and very tall black people,
And-
about 7 foot.
Right, right. We have the same information,
Yeah.
but through another man. He's
I have it both from what I've done remote viewed, and I've had it from the man who was there physically.
okay. Okay, this is
Yeah,
one
that
of
would
them.
that would sort of fit.
This is
Yeah,
one.
that is closer, really, because he did not report to me that they were very large-eyed. Of course, there may be more crew to go back to Earth.
Which crew?
The one that went there
That
for
went
the
there to
Stargate.
visit, yeah.
For the Stargate.
Stargate.
They wanted to go back. He says, oh,
Wow.
the head of the team that went, I think it was 7 or 8 people that went. He says, well, we brought our insurance. It says, we have a little device here. If you decide not to let us go back, we can make this a very warm place and it'll be very uncomfortable.
Really?
Yeah. So they went back. After that, they didn't try that again because they knew we had nuclear weapons, and they didn't want to invoke the possibility of using one of them. We also, of course, have other things, particle beam weapon systems that could take care of them if they get reluctant to continue with their agreement. But so far, there's been no indication that they are breaking their word or their agreements.
These are the source of the Anunnakis that...
Does they have any resemblance of Nibiru? According to what you saw?
Internally, it is a spaceship,
Yes.
and
Right, like,
it's camouflaged to look like a planet.
right.
and what size?
3 times the
About
Earth,
a little under the diameter of the Earth. It's about 7,000 miles in diameter.
So it is smaller than Earth?
Yes.
But,
Smaller than Earth, but
it's
not
one
much.
of the crafts, I believe. Not like the craft we're talking about here. There's different. They didn't say that to you, Mr. Beilik, about that there are more Nibirus.
No. And
They
they
didn't say
didn't
that.
indicate that, so far as I know, to the people who went there.
Okay.
You mean there's more than one Nibiru floating around?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And they are actually from the 19th galaxy. They call it Elohim. It's also written in certain holy scriptures.
That was originally, I mean, they were from there.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
No?
And they
Never
came
heard
to
any
the
of that.
Orion constellation.
Never heard anything about that. The only thing I do know, they have a very nasty reputation, and Sitchkin has shown this too in his writings, that they like to eat human flesh.
Yeah, this is a part of the reptilian part of the Anunnakis. You have a different groups. That's what you like.
Yeah.
Like what
That
you
is the
said.
reptilian groups primarily,
Right.
because I saw that
Right.
down below, further down on the planet. There's a group of very nasty-looking reptilian
Yes.
types.
I think
On the
they-
same ship.
Yes, on the same
How you
ship.
call this?
Because
this
that
movie?
is it's a council of worlds on that planet, on that ship, council of worlds. That they actually representing many civilizations. that-
You mean the Nibiru people?
The Nibiru.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Oh,
So
boy.
there will be some
We're
that are
talking some
reptilian.
This is 7 o'clock. I've got a dinner appointment at 7 o'clock.
Oh, really? Let's go.
And they're supposed to call me up in my room. Maybe I'll just find them down in the bar. Oh, they said he'd be down
But
there.
sorry, we.
Okay.
They are down there already? Okay. Did you make mention to them that I'm... Okay, okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Is this, I think this is the book.
Excuse me. Come and sit next to your brother real quick. You don't want to? Okay, that's okay.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, that's a long and interesting story how I found him, too.
Yeah?
Your brother.
Yeah.
Yes, I wanted to ask you about
He
him.
was born in 1950. He didn't know for sure whether he was born of that family or was adopted, and he found out later he was
Could you
adopted.
just give me your website on that?
The website?
And it,
Let's see if I can do this.
Can I order this through this?
Yes, you can go to Atlanta. This is
I noticed they had a website.
address.
Not a very good P here.
This is the Nibiru crashing into the earth. All those stories. I'll show this to Mr. Beilik to refer.
Well, it was only a couple of years ago I found out it existed.
the what?
Not the one.
My brother.
Oh,
I got a bunch of missing brothers and relatives around.
A mothership.
Oh, okay, so it's not Nibiru.
Good call.
It's a
Thank you very much. And
This is one.
Can you write the website for me?
What?
The website.
I'll give it to you.
Oh, okay.
And let me
Yeah.
give you, let's see if I have it here. I want to give you one of
Where
my
do you
cards.
live now?
Fort Myers, Florida.
Florida.
I was in Atlanta for many years.
Email. Please, email address. Oh, you got a card. Thank you.
And let's see if this is the older one. Yeah, it has the emails on there, the albeilik.com. Forget, that's not going to be used anymore. It'll be philadelphiaexperiment.com.
Oh, but this one is still not.
Yes. Yep. albeilik@juno.com.
Have you updated the information?
All the best, Mr. Beilik, brother. Awesome. Take care of your brother.
It's hard to do this in the U.S., but there are people waking up in the U.S., believe it or
Is
not.
this where I can
Yeah.
write
Still the
to?
people
Yes.
of the ostrich number bury their head in the sand and don't want to hear anything else.
They're always going to have them.
The majority are waking up now.
I have, make sure I have everything. Is there some paper?
I'm not familiar with this part of the building.
And what is the name of this book?
Holy tablets. This is a direct translation of the Ema Elish and the Hivalmus epics.
Great.
And
That's what this says, the Holy Tablet?
Yes, the hieroglyphs is very easy to learn.
Okay, let me.
Yes, I'm greatly honored to have here as our guest a very renowned writer, an author of a number of books, among which you find Crossfire, which is about the assassination of President Jeff Kennedy. Another one, The Alien Agenda, something that is worth reading for all those that have been hearing about UFOs and what influence they may be having on us and why there is a cover-up. Another book is Rule by Secrecy, the latest book of Jim Mars, the book that you should read in order to understand the situation as it is now, why there is war here and there, why things are happening the way they are happening. You'll never regret having a copy of this book. Here we have the very author of these books, Mr. Jim Mars. Welcome, Mr. Jim Mars, because we are having a good audience here for you to brief them about what you've done, your research. You've done extensive research in the assassination of President Kennedy, which mystified a lot of people, and you managed to dig up lots of facts which people have, even up to now, never really had access to. And a lot of other facts about UFOs and their agenda on this planet. I'm glad you are here to give us a new approach to this sort of information, right from the horse's mouth. And you also give us something to do with the present situation in the world, as you put it in your latest book, Rule by Secrecy. Welcome to the audience.
Well, thank you. It's a very great honor to be here, and it's always a pleasure to speak with everyone and share the information that I have, and I appreciate the chance for this interview, Dr. Ssali.
Could you tell us where you come from?
Yes, I am a native of Fort Worth, Texas. Just a good old boy from Texas, but I'm not stupid. I got a college education. I began to read and begin to learn. My degree is in journalism, and I worked as a working journalist for a good number of years, and I had an opportunity to travel widely. I've been to Tibet, China, the Middle East, Europe, and of course travel is good for you because travel educates you. You learn about the world, you learn about other people's, and so in my newspaper work I also traveled widely in different stratas of society, from the military authorities, police authorities, banking officials, street people, bag ladies, you name it. I've had experience all the way around, so I consider myself kind of the last of a dying breed, which is I consider myself a generalist. I know a little bit about a whole lot of things, but I don't claim to be an expert in any one particular thing. But I think this may be good, and I think this may be lacking in American society today, because in our societies, everyone is so specialized. Oh, you're into medicine, or you're a lawyer, or you're a chemist, or you're a computer programmer, and often you don't know anything outside of your own field of expertise. And I think that's kind of sad, because sometimes you have to back off so you can see the forest and not just the trees.
I think you're very right about that. A lot of people tend to specialize too much. And what you've done as a journalist, I think, is remarkable. Because now, you say you come from America, from Texas. Now, let me ask you, because the current events now in the world are everywhere on television, and that's about the war in Iraq. And the man that is behind that war in Iraq is President Bush. And if I'm not mistaken, is from your home area, your state. Now, could you tell us something to do with the situation as related to your knowledge of President Bush?
Well, I would like to make it very, very plain that I do not consider President Bush a Texan. He's not a Texan. He came to Texas. He's no more a Texan than I'm a New Yorker. Okay, the Bush family came from Connecticut. They're old line establishment family, and I think that what's happened here is the same thing that Meyer Rothschild did back in the couple of centuries ago when he sent his sons to London and Vienna and Paris, and they all established their own power bases there, and then they played those countries off against each other. Okay, so I think that they sent Bush in so that he could put this persona forward that he's a good Texan and a good oil man and a businessman, and I think there's much more there that's going on, and I don't think that everyone in the United, I know for a fact that not everyone in the United States is fully supportive of what President Bush is doing right now. There are underlying issues, underlying agendas. The unfortunate war in Iraq right now is not as simple as he would like to make it. For example, they're talking now, since the war began, that this is for the liberation of Iraq. Well, excuse me, during the 80s when Senior Bush had backed Saddam Hussein, was his good friend, gave him weapons of mass destruction to use against Iran in their 8-year war, where was the talk about liberation then? When Saddam Hussein used poison biochemical weapons against his own people, the Kurds, where was the talk of liberation then? So there is a lot of hypocrisy and a lot of deceit that is going on right now with this current war in Iran.
So,
What was your next question, Professor?
so I think
Yeah?
that it is an agenda. I was going to say, so you think there is a secret agenda behind the operations in the Middle East?
Okay.
And I wanted him
Yes.
to ask to tell us.
Okay,
what.
this will lead into the areas that I think you all want to talk about.
Yes,